Seattle had an odd way of mirroring my mood. On that particular morning, the city was shrouded in a perpetually gray drizzle, as if the sky itself was uncertain about whether it should weep or merely hang there in silent melancholy. From the window of the tiny apartment I shared with Emily, I could see the outlines of the towering pines in the distance, partially obscured by a fine mist. The dull hum of traffic several stories below was occasionally interrupted by the hiss of tires on wet pavement. The entire backdrop felt like a stage set for a play in which I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to star. Inside our cramped living room, the smell of overcooked coffee beans lingered. I had accidentally let the French press sit on the hot plate too long, resulting in a distinctly burnt aroma that, strangely enough, felt almost comforting that morning. Maybe it was because my own thoughts felt just as scorched and muddled. Emily had already taken up her usual spot on our second-hand couch, a fraying piece of furniture that we'd found at a local thrift store. She was humming something softly, an indie tune that she'd recently discovered on a late-night YouTube binge. The sound of her voice reminded me of the breezy warmth I often associated with her presence. She was the kind of person who could transform a bland, unremarkable day into something shimmering with potential. We were an unlikely duo. While she thrived on spontaneous bursts of life, like deciding to bake muffins at 3 a.m. or dragging me out to see a neon art installation, I anchored myself in plans, calendars, and carefully outlined schedules. I was in my final semester at the University of Washington, teetering between the fear of stepping into the unknown after graduation and the icy comfort of academic structure. Books and papers, with their neatly drawn lines of logic, gave me a sort of illusory control. Emily, on the other hand, was luminous and alive. She had these amber-colored eyes that sparkled with mischief whenever she got excited, like when she discovered a new local band or decided our living room needed yet another houseplant. Our windowsills were jammed with small pots housing succulents, spider plants, and a few ferns. She affectionately named them things like Ferny Sanders and Leafy Gaga. Sometimes I teased her that the plants loved her more than they loved me. But the truth was, I admired the way she took care of them and, in a sense, the way she tried to take care of me, too. By all measures, our friendship was easy. We laughed at each other's dumb jokes, passed hours binging the same Netflix series, and she always knew instinctively when to leave me alone with my thoughts. And me! I tried not to notice the way her dark hair fell around her face, no matter how carelessly she twisted it up, or the subtle manner in which she bit her lower lip when she was deep in concentration. I definitely didn't allow myself to dwell on the comfortable dip in the couch cushion she left behind every time she got up, which somehow, in my mind, felt like a metaphor for her mark on my life. But that morning, as the city whispered its secrets through the steady drizzle, I sensed a subtle shift in the air between us. There was a new electricity to each glance we exchanged, a tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge. I couldn't put it into words at the time. All I knew was that something was poised to change, and that realization scared me a lot more than the idea of graduating and confronting the real world. At least with graduation, I had a timeline. The semester would end, my diploma would be handed to me, and a door would open to my future. But this tension, this undercurrent of unspoken possibilities, there was no syllabus or schedule for that. I remember looking at Emily, hunched over her phone, her brows slightly knitted in curiosity as she scrolled through some photos on social media. She looked up at me, caught my gaze, and gave me a gentle smile, one that said she cared, that she noticed me noticing her. My heart did a funny little lurch, and I quickly turned back to my laptop screen to hide the blush creeping across my cheeks. In that tiny moment, I felt as though the ground beneath us shifted an inch, even if the rest of the world was still. That was the beginning, before the storm of feelings, confusion, and heartbreaks. And at the time, I had no idea that the city's gray drizzle was foreshadowing a torrent about to break in my heart. It all started to unravel, or maybe it began to reveal itself on a lazy Saturday afternoon. Seattle's skyline was obscured by a deep fog, and raindrops pattered incessantly against the glass of our living room window. The two of us were sprawled on the couch under a pile of mismatched blankets, rewatching a sitcom we'd probably seen 1,000 times. It was one of those days where you're too lazy even to order takeout, the world outside feeling distant and unimportant. Emily's laughter was the first thing that signaled to me that something was different. It wasn't just the usual carefree giggle that I found so contagious. It was deeper, more resonant, as though something in her chest was vibrating with extra intensity. She shifted closer, leaning her head against my shoulder. The weight of her against me felt both comforting and, strangely, electric. I could smell the faint hint of her coconut-scented shampoo, which sent a small shiver rippling down my spine. "You're acting kind of weird today," she said, glancing up at me. Her eyebrows arched in playful concern, but there was curiosity in her gaze. She squinted, as though trying to read the hidden lines of my expression. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to play it off with a laugh, one that came out sounding forced and brittle. "I'm just tired," I managed to say. "I was up late working on that paper for my postmodern lit class." She gave me a half smile. "You sure that's it?" I nodded too quickly, fumbling with the edge of the blanket. The truth was, my heart had been drumming erratically ever since she leaned against me. If I was being honest with myself, which I was desperately trying not to be, my mind had been drifting to spaces I'd never allowed it to go before. I felt hyper-aware of every shift of her body, every breath she took, the texture of her shirt brushing against my arm. And there was a part of me that wondered if she felt it too. That night, as I lay in bed with my biology textbook open but unread, my mind spun in circles. I had known for some time that I wasn't entirely straight, but it had always been a vague notion, an abstract concept, never pinned to someone I knew. In my deeply regimented life, I hadn't allowed those feelings to take any real shape. Now, with Emily so close in proximity, physically and emotionally, those thoughts were harder to shove into the recesses of my mind. Over the following days, these unspoken stirrings grew louder. Simple tasks like grocery shopping became charged events. In the produce aisle, we reached for the same avocado at the same moment, our fingers brushing briefly. My pulse soared, and I quickly let go, pretending I suddenly remembered I needed to pick up cereal. She watched me, eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and something I couldn't quite place. In the kitchen, when we were preparing meals, she'd sometimes step behind me to grab a cup or a plate, placing a steadying hand on my waist for just a second longer than strictly necessary. I'd hold my breath, my skin tingling where she touched me. Every glance, every moment seemed to hold a weighty significance, but still, I denied it. I told myself it was stress, or exhaustion, or that I was reading into things because I'd had too many late-night coffees. Yet a persistent question crept in. What if I actually wanted these moments to carry meaning? What if I wasn't just misreading signals? The fear of losing our easy friendship if I admitted these feelings, that was the part I couldn't handle. A voice in my head chided me. "You're risking everything here. And for what? A possibility. A spark that might not be real." But it felt real. Far too real to bury under my usual avalanche of denial. It happened without warning one night after we'd been out with a few friends in Capitol Hill, a vibrant neighborhood known for its nightlife and quirky energy. The neon signs of local bars and clubs cast shimmering reflections across the slick streets. My boots were soaked from the relentless drizzle, and a slight buzz from a couple of glasses of wine made everything feel a little softer around the edges. Emily and I had been walking close, sharing an umbrella that was barely big enough for one person. She laughed at something, an offhand remark about the group of rowdy tourists we'd passed, and her laugh lit up the space between us. At the crosswalk, she reached out and held my hand, ostensibly to guide me safely across the slippery asphalt. The warmth of her hand lingered in mine, even after we stepped onto the sidewalk, and she let go. By the time we got home, we were both soaked through and giggling over the fact that we still hadn't invested in a decent umbrella. Our apartment was dark, except for the dull glow of a street lamp outside that cast diagonal stripes of light through the blinds. I shrugged off my wet jacket, draping it over the back of a chair. As I turned back around, I realized Emily was standing closer to me than I had expected. My heart lurched, and all the air seemed to vanish from the room. There was a moment suspended in time. Her eyes flickered with something: curiosity, desire, uncertainty. The corners of her lips curled into a tentative smile, and in that heartbeat of anticipation, I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. Before I could overthink, before I could plan a strategy or run away, she leaned in and pressed her lips to mine. The kiss was soft, almost tentative, but also startling in its intensity. It felt like lightning sparking across my skin. For a single, blissful second, the rest of the world fell away. I let myself sink into that electric moment, letting her warmth wrap around me in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. But panic was never far behind. An alarm bell went off in my mind. This is Emily, my best friend, my roommate, the person I shared everything with. Guilt and fear warred with a sudden rush of longing. I broke away, stepping back, my eyes wide. I stammered, but the words died in my throat. I couldn't form a coherent sentence. Emily looked at me, her expression full of a raw vulnerability I'd never seen before. She almost reached out, then pulled her hand back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice trembling ever so slightly. "I thought, maybe, I misread." She trailed off, and in that silence, my heart thundered. I wanted to tell her not to apologize, to explain that I was scared out of my mind, but not necessarily upset that it happened. But I couldn't, so I stood there, chest tight, and watched her back away. The next few seconds felt like they stretched into an eternity. My mind spun, trying to process the swirl of emotions. When Emily finally ducked into her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her, I remained standing in the hallway, jacket still dripping onto the floor, my lips still tingling with the memory of her. In the days that followed, the apartment was filled with a tension so thick you could almost see it hanging in the air. Where once we might have shared casual laughs while brushing our teeth in the morning, now there was an awkward dance of avoidance. She would wake up early and leave for her shift at the local art supply store before I made it to the kitchen. I found reasons to stay late on campus, burying myself under stacks of library books, just to dodge the painful silence that had replaced our easy companionship. Deep down, I knew we needed to talk, but every time I tried to gather the courage to knock on her door, my nerve faltered. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her altogether, not just as someone I might have deeper feelings for, but as my friend, my confidant, the person who'd been by my side through messy breakups and exam stress, lazy Saturdays, and spontaneous road trips to the ocean. One evening, unable to study any longer, I headed to Elliott Bay Book Company, a place that was practically my sanctuary. The cavernous bookstore smelled of old pages and freshly brewed espresso. I found a secluded wooden table near the back, where the overhead lights were dim, casting a warm glow that felt comforting. I opened a book, trying to focus on the printed words, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in our hallway. I kept replaying the sensation of Emily's lips on mine, the rush of heat that flared through me, and then the cold wave of panic. I felt like I was torn in half. Part of me craved more of that warmth, while the other part was reeling from the idea that everything between us might be permanently altered. My phone buzzed, jarring me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen and saw Emily's name. For a moment, my heart pounded so loudly that I wondered if other patrons could hear it. Her message was simple. "Are you coming home soon?" I stared at the glowing letters, my hand trembling slightly. What did she want to talk about? My imagination spiraled in 1,000 directions. Maybe she wanted to say it was a mistake, that she never should have kissed me. Maybe she'd already started looking for another roommate. Fear curled in my stomach like a cold, heavy knot, but I forced myself to type back. On my way. I arrived at our apartment to find Emily curled up on the couch, knees drawn to her chest. She looked up as I entered, and in her eyes I saw a swirl of emotions: sadness, regret, hope, maybe even a touch of fear. Wordlessly, I sat down on the other end of the couch. We faced each other as if the space between us was an uncharted gulf. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hushed, as though afraid of disrupting the fragile quiet that clung to the room. I nodded, folding my hands in my lap. "I'm sorry," I blurted, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was apologizing for. My panic, my silence, or maybe just how complicated everything had suddenly become. Emily shifted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Don't be," she said. I'm the one who... I shouldn't have... No, I interrupted, surprising both of us with the firmness in my tone. It's not that I didn't want you to. It's just... I paused, swallowing hard, trying to quell the trembling in my stomach. I'm so confused. I don't know what to do or how to feel. I don't want to lose you. Her amber eyes softened, and she moved a bit closer. I don't want to lose you either, she whispered, tears threatening to spill. But I also can't pretend I don't feel more than I probably should. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a kiss. It was about months, maybe even years, of unspoken tension, of closeness that bordered on intimacy, of feelings that each of us had likely been trying to sweep under the rug. We'd both hit a point where pretending was no longer an option. We talked deep into the night, voices hushed. I confessed that I'd felt more for her for some time now, but was afraid to name it. She admitted the same, that she had tried to tamp down feelings because we lived together and because she wasn't sure how I would respond. It was a bittersweet revelation, comforting to learn we weren't alone in our confusion, yet terrifying because it meant the stakes were real. By the time the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we were emotionally spent. We said our tentative goodnights, each retreating to our own room. Despite the progress we'd made by talking, I still felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on my chest. Where did we go from here? Would our friendship survive this shift? And more urgently, did I even want it to remain just a friendship? Over the next couple of weeks, we navigated the delicate balance of trying to function as roommates while exploring this new depth of connection. It was far from smooth sailing. One day, we'd fall into our old rhythm, cooking dinner side by side, laughing about silly memes, only to wake up the next morning in a cloud of awkwardness. Our friends, who had always seen us as inseparable, began to suspect something was off. A few asked if we'd had a fight. I found myself stumbling over half-truths, not knowing how to explain the real story. We weren't exactly fighting. We were fumbling through an emotional minefield. At night, the tension magnified. I'd lie awake, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling, my mind replaying the way Emily's face had looked just before she kissed me. The memory was both a comfort and a torment. Sometimes I would hear her moving around in the living room, the soft shuffle of her feet on the carpet. I wondered if she was thinking about me, if she was feeling the same pang of longing I was. One night, it all came to a head. The burden of unexpressed feelings had grown too heavy. I felt like I was suffocating, caught between the desire to be near her and the terror of ruining everything. Heart hammering, I got out of bed, still dressed in a worn t-shirt and flannel pajama pants, and padded down the hallway to her bedroom door. I hesitated, hand raised, poised to knock. Every bone in my body told me to turn around, but I forced myself to stay. When Emily opened the door, I saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She was wearing an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and her cheeks looked flushed, as though she'd been crying or maybe just lost in her own anxious thoughts. I need to talk, I managed, voice cracking slightly. She nodded, stepping aside. I noticed the glow of the small desk lamp illuminating a half-finished sketch on her table. Emily was an art minor, and she often doodled or painted when she was stressed. My gaze fell on the sketch, two figures facing each other, backs turned to the viewer, holding hands. Even though I couldn't see the faces, something about it told me it was us. I swallowed hard, feeling tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. But I'm tired of pretending that we're just normal friends, because we're not anymore. She nodded, her expression pained yet hopeful. So where does that leave us? 1,000 words clamored in my mind, but only one answer felt right. I want you, I said, my voice trembling with the weight of the admission. I'm scared, but I want to see where this goes. With you. Something in her face broke open, a flood of relief and emotion that made my chest constrict. She reached for my hand. That simple touch felt like both a spark and a balm, stirring up the intense yearning I'd been wrestling with for weeks. We kissed, and this time, there was no immediate jolt of panic to break us apart. I felt myself melting into her warmth, anchored by the soft press of her mouth and the faint scent of her coconut shampoo. The electricity was still there, that exhilarating current that made my heart beat faster than I ever thought possible. But overshadowing it was a sense of tenderness, a sense of coming home to a place I hadn't realized I was missing until now. Afterward, we sat on her bed, hands intertwined, talking in low voices about what this meant. We agreed we'd take it slow. No declarations of labels just yet, no rushing to tell every friend. We wanted to protect what felt fragile and precious, to give ourselves time to figure out the shape of us. In a world that often demands immediate clarity, we allowed ourselves a space to be uncertain, to discover each other anew. Just when I thought I was beginning to find some footing in this new territory, life threw another curveball. The day after Emily and I first truly acknowledged our feelings and spent the night talking and tentatively kissing, I woke up to a text from my mother. The notification felt like a cold splash of water. My relationship with her had always been respectful but distant. She had her expectations for me, and I mostly fulfilled them to keep the peace. I unlocked my phone to see her message. "We need to talk. Call me as soon as you can." Anxiety gnawed at my gut. My mom was the type who believed in presenting a certain image, a stable job, a stable relationship with a respectable partner, a neat trajectory for life. I paced around my room for a solid 10 minutes before I mustered the courage to dial her number. When she answered, her tone was clipped. "I heard something unusual," she began. "From a friend of mine who lives in Seattle." I froze, my throat going dry. How could she possibly have found out about me and Emily? We hadn't posted anything on social media, hadn't told any mutual acquaintances, yet somehow the news had traveled. Perhaps it was just speculation, or maybe someone spotted us looking too cozy at a bar or in a cafe. Seattle could feel like a small town sometimes, especially within certain social circles. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What did you hear?" The silence that followed was excruciating. "That you've been involved with your roommate." Her choice of words stung. I felt the sting of disapproval in every syllable. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear her next sentences. "I don't understand it," she said, her voice stern and tinged with a kind of disappointment that felt like a slap in the face. "This isn't what you were raised to do. It's not who you are." I felt my eyes burn with tears. "Mom, you don't know who I am," I wanted to shout. But instead, I listened to her list all the reasons why she thought this was a terrible idea, how it would derail my future, how it was a phase, how it wasn't me. The conversation ended with her telling me we'd talk more later. When I hung up, I was shaking. The phone slipped out of my grasp and clattered onto the floor. Emily must have heard the commotion. She appeared in my doorway, eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, rushing over to kneel beside me. Tears spilled over, and I tried to wipe them away with the sleeve of my sweater. "My mom, she found out, or at least she suspects. She said it's not who I am." Emily wrapped her arms around me, and I buried my face in her shoulder. For a moment, the anger and pain radiating in my chest made it hard to breathe. It wasn't just about my mother's disapproval. It was the sense that my entire life plan, my neat and orderly existence, was fracturing under the weight of something that felt profoundly right. "She doesn't get to define you," Emily whispered, her voice gentle yet firm. "You know that, right? Only you do." But at that moment, I wasn't sure I believed her. My head spun with the fear that I might lose my family's support, that I might never meet their standards again. And beneath that was another fear. What if my mother was right, and this was just a fleeting thing, bound to cause heartbreak and chaos? I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my stomach in knots, barely able to focus on anything but the possibility of my life crumbling. Emily stayed close, offering comfort but also giving me space. When night fell, I stared at the city lights blinking through the window, feeling more alone than ever. Yet, in the quiet of my despair, Emily's presence was a steady anchor. The conflict raged in my mind, but I knew, deep down, I wanted to fight for what we were building. The days and weeks that followed were a tumultuous blend of breakthroughs and breakdowns. My mother and I had more difficult phone calls, some ending in tears, others in raised voices. I tried to explain that I was still me, that Emily wasn't some destructive force but a person I cared about deeply. My mother remained stubborn, but there was a subtle softening each time we spoke, as if she was coming to terms, slowly, with the fact that I wasn't going to back down. Amid this familial storm, Emily and I found a quiet strength in each other. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes my anxieties flared, and I'd snap at her over insignificant things, like the day she came home with a new plant, and I irrationally accused her of cluttering our already tiny apartment, but she never snapped back. She'd wait for me to calm down, then gently ask if something else was bothering me. That level of patience and understanding simultaneously broke me and healed me. It showed me that maybe love, and yes, I was beginning to realize it was love, could be kind and patient and messy and real all at once. We took small steps outward. We'd hold hands when we walked through certain parts of the city, though never too close to campus, where I feared prying eyes. We had a few date nights, trying out the more eclectic restaurants in Capitol Hill, sometimes side by side in a cozy booth, our knees brushing under the table. Each time we stepped out together, I felt a thrilling mixture of defiance and freedom, a sense that I was claiming my life, my choices, and my happiness on my terms. Eventually, we tackled the hardest obstacle of all, introducing Emily to my mother in person. When my mom flew to Seattle for a weekend visit, under the pretense of checking out potential neighborhoods for me to live after graduation, I sat her down in our living room and introduced her to Emily. The tension was palpable. My mom was polite, but her stiffness was obvious, and I could tell Emily felt every ounce of her judgment. Still, we made it through dinner without any catastrophic outbursts. By the end of the weekend, my mother offered Emily a small, tentative smile and mumbled something about making sure you two are safe. It wasn't acceptance in the grandest sense, but it was a step. Progress, however incremental, felt monumental in that moment. The true tipping point came one sunny afternoon, an anomaly in Seattle, when Emily and I decided to take a ferry to Bainbridge Island. As the ferry cut through the water, the city's skyline receding behind us, I found myself on the deck, leaning against the railing, inhaling the crisp air. Emily stood beside me, her hand lightly touching mine. The future still felt uncertain, but in that sliver of time, uncertainty felt bearable, even exciting. I realized then that I didn't have to have all the answers. Life wasn't an essay question where I needed a perfectly structured conclusion. The world moved, seasons changed, and people grew. I, too, was growing, beyond the confines of my mother's approval, beyond my own fear of the unknown. That same evening, we sat in a small park overlooking the water, watching the sunset. Emily entwined her fingers with mine, and we stayed quiet for a long time, just absorbing the beauty around us. Finally, she squeezed my hand and smiled, the waning sunlight catching the gold flecks in her eyes. "You don't have to be perfect," she whispered. "You just have to be you. That's enough." Her words echoed in my mind long after the sun disappeared, because in them, I found the affirmation I had craved for so long: permission to be imperfect, to love who I loved, and to let life unfold as it would. Now, looking back on everything that transpired, from the first moment Emily and I crossed that fragile line between friendship and something more, I find myself torn between relief and lingering doubt. I have no regrets, but I still wrestle with questions. Where exactly are we headed? Will I finish my final semester and move on to a job in another city, or stay in Seattle with her? Will my mother ever fully accept this new chapter of my life? But maybe the real question is, does it matter? The path we choose will be our own, and I'm learning to trust that we'll navigate it together with all the love and courage we can muster. So if you were in my place, dear reader, would you have done it differently? Perhaps. But I suspect you'd find, as I did, that sometimes the messy, terrifying leap is the only way to discover who you really are and who you might become.